Let's go through the papers in more detail. Oliver Dean is here, the political commentator with Young Voices UK. Oliver, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie. How are you?
I'm very well. Should we start with The Sun's front page? They've basically been looking at foreign aid spending. They've described it as £15 billion aid lunacy. Are they right?
Well, I think it's a difficult thing to say whether it's right. I think we need to have some level of overseas development spending. And we saw when David Cameron was in government that he committed to raising overseas development aid by 0.7% of GDP. Now, whether that overseas development spending is going on worthwhile projects is a different question. So some of the things that The Sun has reported on is, as you say, a study in shrimp health, which is £133,000 worth of taxpayers' money. And another payment of £59,000 was made to the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture. It's really a question as to whether taxpayers are getting, whether taxpayers' money is being spent properly on these projects. And when we're dealing with the situation as we are in Ukraine and Russia, when people are calling on the UK to raise defence spending to 2.5%, which could be upwards of more than £5 billion. When we're calling for troops to potentially be sent into Ukraine to make sure a peace deal can last, we need to be finding that money from somewhere. And when we're spending money on these gimmicks on overseas aid in particular areas across the world, questions need to be asked.
So would you be in support of a cutting down of our spending on foreign aid if it was going to be diverted to spending on UK defence?
I think it would depend on the projects in question. There are a number of projects that are extremely important. So, for example, there are water supply efforts in Somalia and sub-Saharan Africa, which are essential to making sure that children, for example, and women get access to clean water that they wouldn't be able to elsewhere. However, there are programs that we need to really look at. For example, £500,000 towards Albanian prison vehicles, or £44,000 towards alcohol studies in Thailand. I think we need to have a reevaluation as to all the projects, and we need to look at cutting down specific ones. But I wouldn't support a general cut in overseas development aid if it meant that there are projects that are worthwhile and that would end up being cut.
What I fear you're talking about, Oliver, is another review. And this government quite likes reviews, particularly spending reviews.
Yes, well, I mean, look, we've seen Rachel Reeves come out and announce sweeping budget cuts across the board. I think a review is important and a review is necessary because we need to be able to cut down on wasted government spending. And we've seen as well from reports from groups like the Taxpayers Alliance that wasteful government spending is becoming the norm. And if we want to be more efficient, if we want to truly support troops in Ukraine, and if we want to support our European allies, we need to cut down on wasted government spending.
OK, let's move on. There's lots of other stories about spending, perhaps not on such critical things inside the papers. There's been a lot of scrutiny of equality, diversity and inclusion schemes, particularly since Donald Trump really has rallied against them as he's become president for the second time. The Times is reporting that the cost of equality, diversity and inclusion salaries at British universities has doubled in 3 years. It now costs the university sector, which we know has been struggling, £28 million per year. Do you think it's right they spend on this?
Well, I think it's a question, again, as to whether it would be okay if this was just in the private sector or because universities are partly government funded, whether it's worthwhile if taxpayers' money is going towards this. If this was a purely private sector initiative, I wouldn't necessarily have any problems with it because the taxpayer isn't expected to prop systems like this up. But when taxpayers' money is going towards these initiatives, questions need to be asked. Now, I think EDI spending is important, but it's when EDI spending gets out of hand and when it gets too much that we need to maybe cut it down a little bit. We need to reduce spending. We need to put money elsewhere.
It's really difficult, isn't it? It's a really interesting read in the Times. Universities doubling their investment into those schemes, which have had a bit of a PR crisis themselves of the last 3 weeks or so. Something that got a lot of people talking over the weekend, and it's written up in the Mail today, is parents working from home. This is according to the head of Ofsted, is driving what we have seen over the last couple of years is increasing absence from school from children. And the head of Ofsted says, well, the thing is, children see parents not going to work because they're working from home. And so they think, oh, leaving the house and going to school is optional. Do you think he's right?
Well, I'd be a bit hesitant to suggest that that's purely as a result of working from home. We have to remember that at the end of the day, it's parents' decision as to whether children get sent to school. So this idea that children are sitting there saying to parents, well, I'm not going to go to school because you're not going to work is a little bit of a stretch. I think we need to take into account that parents are enabling this. But there are worrying statistics that we're seeing. So 25% of secondary school students are now considered consistently absent. And the absence rate post-COVID has increased by roughly 3 percentage points. So we are seeing a worrying trend of more and more of our children not going into school and receiving the proper education they need. But I think it would be wrong to purely blame that on just working from home.
What's the answer to this? Because working from home, it feels as though is now so deeply ingrained in our culture that it can't really go back to how it was pre-pandemic.
Well, I think part of it there needs to be more of an effort from parents to make sure that their children are going to schools. You know, it's one thing for a child to skive and say that they're ill when they're not actually ill, to maybe get 1 or 2 days off of school. But it's another thing for parents to sit there and enable students and allow their children to stay home from school purely because they themselves are working from home.
But I think actually, Oliver, the parents think, well, actually, at one point you delegated the entire responsibility of my child's education to me, so I can make the decisions on behalf of my child of what I think is most important, and I don't think it's necessary for them to go to school every day.
Well, that's one point to take, but the counterpoint to that is that every child has a right to an education, and you can't get that education unless you're going into school, unless you're sitting in the classroom. And so, whilst parents have that right, the government also has the right to say, parents need to be sending their children into school to make sure that they're getting that education.
This debate is just not going to go anywhere. There are so many benefits, clearly, to people not having such long commutes. It's not so expensive. People can spend more time with their families. I think those arguments are sort of so entrenched now. But I just can't imagine we're going to go back to a situation where everyone's in the office every day. There was quite a funny story in the business news last week, actually, Oliver, where JP Morgan insisted everyone goes back to work 5 days a week, and everyone went in and they discovered they didn't have enough chairs. So they had to sort that out. Now, I did a life drawing class at school when I was 17, and I was quite surprised. I went to an all-girls school and we had a completely nude male model. And that was appropriate. My school thought, and my parents were happy for me to take part in that, age 17. There is a life drawing class. I think actually the person who runs the class is going to be on Times Radio Breakfast a little bit later. A daytime life drawing class that's been running for 30 years has been told to cover up your models. This is in North London, or find another venue. Why?
I mean, it's because it's considered a safeguarding issue, and I think that's quite frankly ridiculous. The people who are partaking in these live drawing classes are predominantly from the older generation, so there's not an issue of consent or safeguarding from my perspective. It's an enclosed environment where these people are willingly consenting to be able to do this. And the initiator of the scheme has come out and said that a lot of the benefits of this come from the fact that it's a way for elderly people to cope with loneliness, so that they can socialise and get together in a social environment. And so this idea that it's some type of safeguarding issue, I think it is just nonsensical and rather silly, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's Tony Swan who runs the class. It's at Hampstead Community Centre. He's going to be on Times Radio Breakfast. The only thing, though, your argument there, Oliver, to say sort of it has an impact on loneliness, that sort of doesn't make a difference if the life model's got clothes or not clothes on. It's not saying that the class can't run. It's just saying that they can't be naked.
No, I suppose you're correct in that. And I mean, the class has been running for 30 years without issue. And so the fact that we're now suddenly seeing people coming out saying it's a safeguarding issue is, as I said, silly and ridiculous. I don't know what has spurred people to take up arms against new live drawing classes, but whatever it is, it's ridiculous.
final thing. I have occasionally, actually, we were talking about lockdown earlier. I used to do, this is quite embarrassing to admit, but I would dance sometimes to try and cheer my mood up because I was working in a newsroom and I just found it so utterly awful. And I had this kind of, feel better playlist. Apparently, dancing, 20 minutes of dancing a day, I mean, it kind of makes sense when you add it all up together, is enough to keep you fit. What has this research found?
Well, it's found that, as you say, if you do 20 minutes of dancing, then you can maintain a healthy lifestyle. Now, luckily, the researchers have said that they're not actually looking at the dance moves themselves; they're just looking at the data, which I think for everybody
Relief,
involved
yes.
is a very good thing. But I think for myself, I might just stick to a few some jogs and going to the gym instead of dancing. But maybe if there's more research done on this, I'll change my tune.
Yeah, bopping for 20 minutes each day as you get your breakfast ready could be enough to give you your daily recommended, or your weekly exercise. They've called it, Olive, which I really enjoy, solo free-form dancing. So that does suggest you've got quite a lot of creative license in there.
It does indeed. It does indeed. But like I said, I don't think I'll be taking up dancing anytime soon. But maybe if I do some classes, I'll feel more inclined to
What
take part.
style would you go for if you had to pick a dance class?
Well, I'm a fan of the robots because I think I can't really do anything else. So I think that's probably
So maybe
for the
like a
best.
hip hop class for you then, Oliver.
Maybe.
Okay.
We'll see.
Oliver, thank you so much. Oliver Dean, political commentator with Young Voices UK, going through the papers with me this morning.